It doesn't matter how hard I try. Whenever I hear the term platformer, I immediately think of Nintendo and Sony. Having played the classics like Super Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, and even Spyro the Dragon, it's no mystery as to why. Those guys absolutely ruled the genre back then and still remain on top even to this day, though more so Nintendo than Sony. In fact, both companies dominated the platform category of games so much that it's easy to forget that Microsoft themselves took a swing at it back in the early 2000s. With titles like Blinx the Time Sweeper, Conquer Live and Reloaded, hell, even Munch's Odyssey, they attempted to capitalize on the craze as well as place a stake with a mascot of their own, but were met with little success. Even back then, Xbox was considered a more mature console, being home to series like Halo, which were at the forefront of the consumer base. Still, this didn't stop Microsoft from experimenting, and resulted in lots of weird oddities like Shrek and Torque Prehistoric Punk. While I'd love to stand here for the next however long and talk about games that frankly creep me the hell out, Microsoft actually produced a few good platforming titles that, given different circumstances, could have performed on the same levels as their competitors' games. There's obviously the duo of Blinx the Time Sweeper games, but there's also the often forgotten Voodoo Vince. Releasing just under a year after the first Blinx game in September of 2003, Beep Industries, now known as Beep Games, collaborated with Microsoft to deliver on a different type of platformer game, as evidenced by its tagline, "Feel His Pain." Now, I don't own this game in its physical form. It's unfortunately one of those titles I missed out on as a kid, despite having an Xbox to play it on. That being said, I did run through its demo numerous times. That was included with this game. Luckily, the game was re-released not too long ago under the guise of a remaster, sporting an all-new display resolution as well as improved load times and frame rate. Any and all footage you see here is from that version. So, let's kick things off, shall we? Voodoo Vince begins on a dark night in the French Quarter of New Orleans as two bumbling henchmen under the command of Cosmo the Inscrutable break into the voodoo shop of Madame Charmaine to steal a bag of voodoo dust. Not knowing exactly what they're dealing with, the two goofballs accidentally unleash the dust into the world, with a bit of it being sprinkled on the Madame's third best voodoo doll, Vince, bringing him to life. Before she can ward the intruders off, however, Charmaine is knocked out and taken along with the dust, leaving it up to Vince to save her and stop Cosmo. Voodoo Vince's core gameplay is fairly standard. Vince comes well equipped with a jump, as well as a double jump, and even a magical hover ability that slows his descent while falling. Think Rayman's helicopter hair or iNinja's sword hover, it's pretty much the same thing. Additionally, he has a punch attack which can lead into a 3-hit combo, a Crash Bandicoot-esque spin maneuver which is good for adding a bit more mileage during jumps, and also a head bash a la Jak and Daxter. Thankfully, even with Vince's penchant for fighting, combat never becomes overwhelming. Baddies exist purely as obstacles to be dispatched quickly, and you'll never find yourself scrambling to remember convoluted button inputs to pull off combos. Defeated enemies drop Mardi Gras beads, which aside from looking cool are imbibed by Vince, filling up his power meter. When full, he can execute a special voodoo power attack which unleashes a devastating one-hit kill to any schmuck unlucky enough to come into contact with it. The game's tagline tells all. Vince inflicts harm on himself to affect others, and aside from being a creative gimmick, shows the potential for more possible games of this caliber. The problem is, Vince's voodoo powers are easily forgotten, at least that's how things were for me early on. Take this for example. I'm in a room full of enemies and I take them down with standard melee attacks, no issues whatsoever. It's only after the fact that I notice, hey, there's spinning fan blades that I could have jumped into and ended things even quicker. In fact, aside from the occasional moments where you have to get past an obstacle blocking your path or during a boss battle, the voodoo powers are rarely used to their fullest extent, which kind of makes the gimmick feel meaningless. Also, am I the only person that finds it funny that Vince can survive being lit on fire, crushed between two trains, and even jumping into a meat grinder, but a simple pit is enough to actually kill him? Don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of opportunities to make short use of enemies with Vince's abilities, and when you do get to unleash his inner beast during the previously mentioned context-sensitive moments or boss fights, it's a good time. Running around to find whatever can kill Vince, and in effect the bosses, is a pretty interesting spin on the formula. It just feels a bit left in the dust is all. Levels are presented as small to medium areas with one objective at hand, a stark contrast to, say, Super Mario Sunshine, which boasted huge areas with a plethora of objectives to complete. This is good for a few reasons, the main one being that it keeps the game in check. See, I find the issue with most platformers, whether good or bad, is that the levels within them are often so oversized that it's incredibly easy to lose track of where you are and get lost. Even in Voodoo Vince's larger levels, if you even want to call them that, things are laid out in a manner that makes it simple for you to know where to go. Thank God for Vince's impeccable double jump, because there's a lot of upwards progression, which is something I admire. You reach the top of a building and look upon where you came, an inclusion very, very reminiscent to Spyro. In fact, if there's one thing I felt through the entire game, it was a sense of familiarity. I'm talking familiarity to titles like Crash Bandicoot, Jak and Daxter, hell, even Psychonauts, which I'm well aware was released a few years after this game, but still. There's even a bit of Rayman here. I already mentioned Vince's hover, but later on he gains the ability to swing from golden circles by means of a grappling hook. Yeah, a lot like swinging from Lums in the Rayman games, but hey, if something's been proven to work, there's no issue with putting your own spin on it, which is definitely something the game does and succeeds at. The controls are tight and the platforming is precise enough where there's no issue. That being said, it's all kind of easy, but not too much. There's never a point where the game feels like it's devoid of any challenge. In addition to that and the combat, there's also the usual job of finding the game's collectibles. You've got zombie dust bags, power skulls, and voodoo icons. Collecting 100 dust bags rewards Vince with an extra hit point. Chasing down and grabbing a skull grants him an extra voodoo power slot, but the icons are a bit different. See, tracking one of these down adds another way for Vince to die, whether it's by means of him getting crushed by a giant foot, being the center of a mafia hit, or overdosing on laxatives, which is a pretty shitty way to die if you ask me. At one point, you find an item known as the All-Seeing Eye, which when used reveals the locations of collectible items, pretty much making the job of anyone looking to 100% the game as easy as can be. But back to the voodoo deaths, as they get pretty interesting. It's honestly fun to find them all and view the various ways Vince can get obliterated. When I say view, I literally mean view. Each and every one of these scenarios is purely cosmetic, having no real weight added. I wager you can go through the entire game with just the pinhead one and be completely fine, but that's not to take away from whatever value these animations hold. It's humorous seeing what type of predicaments Vince gets into, one of my favorites being the shark in the bathtub. The game is ever-changing. No one level will feel like another. A certain event might call for Vince to set himself on fire and blow up gas tanks, while another might have him gathering food items to prepare a gumbo. The point is, it never gets stale. Sure, there's change, but it never begins to feel unwelcome, unlike some other games. Speaking of which, certain missions see you in control of a vehicle, like a plane, submarine, or laundry basket among a few others. Like the game's overall variety, these are done enough, but never to the point where you wish you were playing something else. It's a rare case when a platformer game does vehicles right, but I'll never be one to complain when it happens. Amidst all of this though, the best thing about the game is its presentation and characters. The game already looked beautiful pre-remaster. It was definitely one of the titles that boasted the power of the OG Xbox, but seeing it running at 1080p with 60 FPS really makes me want to see more Xbox games get their rightful do-over. Sure, there are a few minuscule issues, the most prevalent being the wonky shadows and sometimes overbearing darkness of the game, which in the end was never enough to get me to adjust my TV's brightness levels, but it's still worth mentioning. I don't think it's fair to talk about this game without mentioning its masterfully done soundtrack, which was composed by Steve Kirk. If the name sounds familiar, it's because some of his other work includes composing for both Farmville and even Star Wars: The Old Republic. I gotta say, it really captures the environment set in place. There's lots of string, percussion, and brass instrumental work, setting a very jazzy mood. Now that I think about it, this is probably one of my favorite game soundtracks, right up there with Majora's Mask and the first Spyro. If you can't already tell, I'm a sucker for jazz. All things considered though, gameplay, presentation, none of it matters unless you have likable characters that you can root for, which I'm pleased to announce are present here. Vince himself is a wisecracking pessimist who's very well aware he's in a video game. He kinda reminds me of Gex, even spitting out various lines of dialogue dialogue over the course of the game. The difference is, I don't think anyone's ever played Voodoo Vince on mute. Yeah, he talks and says a few of the same things more than once, but there's a certain level of charm included with the character that allows him to get away with it. It's also not very often that a villain is as likable as the main hero, but Cosmo is a bit of a lovable doofus. He flaunts his power like he's the biggest cheese out there, but constantly flubs on himself, leaving him feeling like a Saturday morning cartoon villain, which works perfectly given the circumstances of the plot. Overall, Voodoo Vince is probably the best platformer the Xbox has to offer, even more so than Blinx the Time Sweeper. Whereas Blinx is remembered for being Microsoft's entry into the platformer genre, Voodoo Vince shows just how much they'd improved in the time since then. I can honestly say I think this game rivals even Jak and Ratchet. It took so many creative ideas, as well as pre-existing ones, mushed them all together and hand-delivered them with a big red bow. So then, why is the game often forgotten? Well, for starters, this existed, which shifted everyone's focus to first-person shooters, but it should also be noted when this game was released. September 23rd, 2003, at least in North America. Not exactly sure why everyone else took it up the rear, like damn! Japan got this game just shy of 10 months after its initial release. Anyway, this date is pretty important because a little over 2 years later, this came out. Yeah. That's pretty much all there is to say about Voodoo Vince. It really is a shame that the game got swept under the rug after its release, but hey man, nostalgia is one hell of a thing, and people from the early 2000s are finally starting to look back at their childhoods and think, wow, that was actually pretty cool. So in saying that, if there's anyone out there listening, probably not, if there was ever a time for Voodoo Vince 2, or anything related to Voodoo Vince, like a spin-off, you know, whatever, it would be now, alright? There's a few reasons why. You know, platformers are making a comeback, and I think the biggest one is that this has become an embarrassment.